Hi everyone! Welcome back to class this week, well, to our second week of classes. I wanted to first let everyone know that I'm only going to actually be giving this lecture for class 2. It's what's most feasible for me at this moment to be able to, to be able to get as much of the information in as quickly as possible. Now, I realized too, especially like this week, there's a lot going on in terms of the amount of documentaries to watch, in addition to the reading. So I wanted to give you a suggestion. You by no means have to follow this, but I find it is useful to, I would consider doing your readings and watching the documentary in this order if you haven't already started it. I would start by reading the chapters in Senso and D'Angelo's book because they spend a lot of time, again, defining things, which I'll do briefly, but they really go into depth. And they give kind of an overview of some of the things that you will be watching in the documentaries Race, Power, and Illusion. So it's helpful to have that background knowledge before getting into the reading. So I suggest you do that, and then I suggest you watch White Like Me after that. So that's also going to tie into Chapter 8. So you can maybe break it up and do Chapter 7 and watch Race to the Power of the Illusion, and then read Chapter 8 and watch White Like Me, however that works for you. And then from there, I recommend reading Tatum's chapter of Chapter 2. I'm going to be specifically asking you a question about that as on your discussion board this week, and so it's helpful to read that after going through Race, the Power of the Illusion and thinking about the concepts of intelligence. And then finally, I think it's best to end with this this short keynote address that was given by Audre Lorde on the uses of anger. So again, it's not imperative that you do it in this order, but that's kind of what made sense to me. So it's what I will recommend for you to do as well. Okay, so just a couple of things to go over again, and the definitions of these are in my notes in once you download this PowerPoint, as well as I'll add them to our Google Doc. But throughout the readings and documentaries, at least Tim Wise's documentary, we heard of this concept of colorblindness, and we've seen it come up, and we'll see it come up again and again. And this is just this idea that we don't see race, that everyone is equal, we are all the same, and therefore it sets the stage of that things are neutral. So, but as Senso and D'Angelo explain in their texts in these opening chapters, this is a dangerous notion because of the fact that it implies that we don't see differences, we don't have a clear sense of the prejudices that we all naturally embody, whether or not we want to be embodying these prejudices. And I will get more into that in just a second. Another word that I wanted to bring up that didn't specifically get talked about in any of the readings here, but was the notion of Caucasian. I know a lot of times when we think we're being formal, we'll hear people say people with black skin are African American, people with white skin are Caucasian. But as of recently, people have been problematizing this term Caucasian. It originally came out of people from I guess it was the Caucasus Mountain region. And it was used to it's typically used to refer to people from European ethnic heritage, and basically those who is perceived as white. And early race scientists talked about how this concept was referred to people of the utmost beauty, the envisionment of beauty. So the historical origins of the word Caucasian actually stems from what we might consider to be this hegemonic presence of what we consider to be beauty. So I prefer to use the terms white and black when I'm talking about race, because we're talking about socially constructed ideas anyway, and what we perceive people to be. Ethnicity is more specific, right, to where people are coming from. So I wanted to bring that up, and the term Caucasian is not it is not actually I don't know if you want to use the word politically correct. It actually has a racist innuendo within the very origins of the word itself. Okay. The other word, white privilege, that pops up a lot, and we're going to talk about a bunch of different ways when we get to intersectionality. We're going to talk about privilege in a bunch of different ways, but specifically for today, we'll talk about white privilege. This term is most often associated with Peggy McIntosh in some early work that she did in the late 70s, early 80s, in an article that is very highly cited, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And so she defines white privilege as, and I quote, an invisible package of unearned assets that I can count on cashing in each day, but that I was, quote, meant, unquote, to remain oblivious, end quote. So, essentially, when we talk about white privilege, we're talking about privileges that are unearned. They're just given to you based on the color of your skin. So, when we talk about white privilege and white supremacy, which I'll talk about in a second, we're talking about systems of privileges. As individuals, white individuals can benefit from them, but we're not necessarily just only pointing out to one individual. We're talking about a system of privileges. Post-racial is something that came up a bunch as well in Tim Wise's piece, as well as in the Senso and D'Angelo chapters. And there's an article here that I've attached should you want to read it. It was published in the Huffington Post. But there's a bunch of stuff like this that you can find about people talking in the age of Obama what post-racial America looks like. In the event of recent events, on the unfortunate terrorist attacks of the Charleston shootings that occurred, I believe it was on Wednesday, that was a very blatantly racial attack on the 9 African American black people in their church. And so that in and of itself, just happening this week, I think demonstrates we're not in a post-racial era. It doesn't matter if it's one person or 100 people. The fact that we have people who are blatantly racist and then not blatantly racist. There's some of the unconscious types of racisms that occur, which we're going to unpack and talk about in more detail. So this idea of post-racial, that the United States, it's devoid of racial preference, discrimination, and prejudice, is something that race scholars and in multicultural education, we do not adhere to the idea that we are in a post-racial society. Racism still exists and it is present. Okay, so white supremacy, and that came up again. That comes up in Senso and D'Angelo's chapter 8 specifically, is dedicated to talking about this, and Tim Wise talks about it as well in the documentary. So I think a lot of times when people hear white supremacy, the first picture that comes to mind is this picture of the KKK. And yes, while that is a form of white supremacy in extreme form, in academia when we're talking about it, it's really this all-encompassing term that is combining white privilege, dominance through hegemony, so that's that, again, remember that consciousness, how we think about things, and advantages in society, and this is through structural and systemic racism. So when I say white supremacy, I'm talking about it in terms of a system. So people, whether or not we want to subscribe, whether or not people say that they benefit from white privilege or not, does not discredit the fact that it exists, and that's a form of white supremacy in society. So we're talking about ideology here, the bigger picture, hegemony, all very important ways of looking at how society is constructed, and this in turn how this influences schools. Okay. Stereotype threat. Let's see. Beverly Tatum talks about it in her piece. It's briefly mentioned, I believe, in the race Power of Illusion documentary. Senso and D'Angelo talk about it. We'll see it again in another documentary that we'll be watching next week. It's very present in this scholarship. So if you want to see, I've also attached a short video here with Claude Steele. Steele and Aronson are the scholars credited with coining this term stereotype threat. They come out of Stanford, and they've done this research on stereotype threat, which is basically a self-fulfilling prophecy proving a negative stereotype to be true. And so they've started off looking at comparing the test scores between white males with black males, and they did this thousands of times. So there's a plethora of data demonstrating the effectiveness of how stereotypes can actually impact students' performance. So they've actually also looked at this in other contexts too, comparing white males with Asian American males, and also looking at gender differences and such. So if you want to watch more about this, there's an interview here, and I just realized I spelled width wrong. Disregard that. But you can watch a little bit more about stereotype threat here. And in turn with thinking about white supremacy, as I was saying, the systemic and structural racism, again, Senso and D'Angelo's chapters are really important in helping to understand this. But these are common practices that we see every day, and they're normalized in society. So versus before when I was talking about post-racial and there being these blatant racist attacks such as killing people, every day there's these other types of systemic and structural racist acts and just practices that occur through things that might seem you might not notice if it's not something that you have faced. And they give several examples in the text talking about higher mortgage rates for people of color, difficulties on loans or credit. The documentary really goes into details in showing how we've set up where people live, communities, neighborhoods, through redlining, through policies of housing acts, how policies prior to the law being changed in the 1950s, this establishment of a white middle class and the amount of wealth that has been accumulated and built on. Think about it, generations after generations where people of color didn't have access to owning land and having that, which is very much a symbol of wealth and in American culture. So, and how neighborhoods are situated then as good neighborhoods versus bad neighborhoods. And then other types of things that we've already talked about in here, like discrimination and hiring practices. We talked last week about the names and how that can impact people being hired. So these are just some examples of systemic, structural, sometimes institutional, you could call it as well, racism. And that are things that occur every day that are part of this bigger system. So as you go through everything this week, you're wanting to, I would encourage you to really look everything this week as the system. Let's start off bigger and look at the macro picture and how that's going to influence as we move smaller and smaller into looking at ourselves. But that's what's really important as you're going through this week, and you might be coming across things that for some of you, this may be the first time you've ever heard this. So you might be feeling, remember, that willingness to be disturbed. You might be feeling that discomfort. So as always, I'm going to encourage you as you're working through that to really be thinking, okay, bigger picture, what do I need to know here? So moving into that, some of the major themes that are coming across this week is really the race, the power revolution is really going to help us to understand how race is a biological myth. So we're gonna learn about where these ideas have come from. What does this mean when we say race is socially constructed? And more importantly, why should this matter today? So why does all of this that we're talking about, this history, why should it matter today? And I think that probably the most important thing about today's, about the documentaries that we're watching this week is, I think it's helpful to watch these documentaries because we're taking centuries of history and putting them in documentary format. And it is imperative. Anybody going into any classroom, any form of education, I mean, I think people in general, humanity, needs to understand the history of how power and social class and relationships and all that have influenced schooling today. And this starts from understanding the bigger picture. So this history is incredibly important. So I encourage you, again, as you're going through that, to really think about what did you learn in school? What things do you feel you already knew that you had learned in school? What knowledge did you already have? What are completely new things that you're learning as you're watching these documentaries? And also, as Senso and D'Angelo really adamantly point out, and I agree with it, when we think about racism, it's more than just the individual acts. Of course, there can be individual acts of racism, but this is really, we're talking about a collective group pattern, and it's through the overt and the covert form. So it's something that we need to think about it. It's endemic. It's ingrained in our society. And then one more concept that I want you to think about as you're reading through this week, that is something I get into conversations about this a lot with people, especially being a white scholar doing anti-racist work myself. I think Senso and D'Angelo do a nice job setting this up, but they talk about how people can have prejudice or discrimination towards white people. So sure, there could be that prejudice and discrimination, and we're going to talk more about what that looks like in the next class. But this is not racism. The very presence of racism and the idea of racism, it has to do with power relations. And if we understand that there's a system of white supremacy in place that privileges whiteness, in a sense, in society, so in that larger picture, then when we talk about racism, it's not, you can't be racist toward a white person because that white person automatically holds this power just for possessing whiteness as property, as the critical race scholar talks about, Cheryl Harris, whiteness as property. So that's something important to remember, and that might be something hard for some people to wrap their minds around. So again, think about that as you're reading through this week and thinking about the differences between what it means when we're talking about racism and when we're talking about prejudice and discrimination. And on page 101 in Senso and D'Angelo's book, they really highlight these differences here between, I think in the middle of the page, I think it's important to look at, where they say racism is not fluid in that it does not move back and forth, one day benefiting whites and another day or even era benefiting people of color. The direction of power between whites and people of color is historic, traditional, normalized, and deeply embedded in the fabric of U.S. and Canadian societies. So the critical differences here with racism from racial prejudice and discrimination is really this historical background and the implications that it continues to hold today for society as a whole, and then specifically what we're looking at in terms of education. So as you're going through these documentaries, these are kind of the main outcomes that you really want to be focusing on as you're watching them. So the first episode here really goes through the scientific and genetic background information about why it's illogical to actually sort people through biological races. So you see examples of students in high school doing these genetic tests and seeing that a white male has more is more genetically close to a black female than like another white male in the class. So genetically speaking, it doesn't make sense. But then episode 2 traces the history of where this concept of race actually evolved from, and how this has been historically a part of our narratives, and how this has had a control over our minds. And again, this is hegemony. And then finally, episode 3 shows how once this knowledge became normalized and these hegemonic forces created this concept of race, with science, quote unquote, legitimizing why this existed, how this affected things such as the housing market. So they use that example of the housing market and this idea of race, and how this has continued to impact divides in quote unquote race again today. So as the history behind this is, I think, really important to understanding current issues that we talk about today. Now, this came along with the documentaries here, and these are the 10 things everyone should know about race. And you can read this to yourself. But I think that, like, it's talking about race as a modern idea. Like, this isn't something that has been around since the beginnings of times, and that there's no genetic basis. That would suggest that human subspecies exist, and we haven't been around long enough for that to happen. So again, skin color is only skin deep. Most variation is within and not between. I find that very interesting. Slavery predates race. Race and freedom were born together. Race justified social inequalities as natural. Race isn't biological, but racism is still real. And colorblindness will not end racism. Okay. So as you go through and you are learning about the history of how the concept of race has been formed in society and normalized, when you go through then and read Beverly Tatum's chapter, you'll have that background knowledge to help you with answering the questions that I ask. So Beverly Tatum, she is a race psychologist. So I tend to read a lot more of work coming out of sociology or anthropology than I do psychology, but I find her work to be very interesting. Right now she's the president of Spelman College, which is a historically black women's college in Atlanta, Georgia. And she became really well known after the publication of her book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And she does a lot of anti-racist training with pre-service teachers and other educators in the field. So one of the reasons, too, that I always, when I'm going through and deciding on the readings and thinking about, oh, well, what should we do, I always come back to this quote of hers and thinking about how this is so important when we're talking about intelligence. And when I used to teach educational psychology, and we would go through and read about all these IQ tests and different things, and it was always something that really bothered me, so I started using this piece alongside it. And it's this quote here at the bottom, that it's worth reviewing the history of notions of intelligence in our effort to connect the dots of race and achievement. Because I think it is essential to understand how deeply embedded a scientifically suspect idea is in our American system of education, and how inherently rooted in the racism of the eugenics movement. So why I continue to use this piece is that Tatum really traces through the idea of intelligence and what that looks like. So this directly connects to this idea that we have of an achievement gap in schools, and how this impacts students today in our classroom. Okay. One of the other readings that we have for the week, and one of the last ones I was asking you to read, is Audre Lorde. And Audre Lorde, she was a Caribbean-American activist, feminist. She worked through the civil rights movement, poet. And she, I think, I came across her work through her critique of feminist work in the 1960s. And again, Senso and D'Angelo briefly talk about this a little bit, but when we think of feminist work and a lot of the people who are often cited within feminism, it tends to be the white middle class woman whose struggles were very different from black women at the time. And Senso and D'Angelo point this out, that white middle class women, a lot of what they were fighting for was equality within the workplace and such, but black women historically had always been in the workplace, and they didn't have the luxury of staying home. They would be perceived as lazy. And not working and a slacker. So these were very different struggles at the time. So much of her work that stemmed out of this was through this theory of difference, which really emphasized how a binary between men and women even is too simplistic. She began working with womanism, which came out of Alice Walker's work on the struggles of the divide between the black and female of color experience, from what is historically associated with feminism. So this piece actually is from a keynote address that Lorde gave at the National Women's Association, really with the premise of shifting the views of the white feminist audience and really getting to the root of the issues at hand. So a few things that I pulled out here, this quote here, the first one: mainstream communication does not want women, particularly white women, responding to racism. It wants racism to be accepted as an immutable given in the fabric of your existence, like evening time or the common cold. So again, if this divide was created in feminism and womanism between white women and black women, that would mean that there's a problem with race still. And like, this is 1981 that we're talking about it, and there are still these conversations today with this idea that if we live in a post-racial society, we should all be working together in this idea of humanity. And that's not putting forward the idea that the racism is still a problem in society, and in this, not just this country, but in society as a whole. And so I think Audre Lorde's work is really helpful here to think about how we need to give credence to these differences. And we're going to talk a little bit more about her work again when we get more specifically into intersectionality. And another quote that I like to point out that I thought really spoke to me, and so I'll share with you, and this is the other one. I cannot hide my anger to spare your guilt, nor your feelings, nor answering anger. For you to do so insults and trivializes all of our efforts. Guilt is not a response to anger. It is a response to one's own actions or lack of action. If it leads to change, then it can be useful, since it is then no longer guilt, but the beginning of knowledge. I thought when I was reading this too that this quote really spoke to the concept of when you're grappling with this idea of whiteness and white guilt, and understanding being part of a system that is just there, and what to do with that when you come to this acknowledgement. And so she really talks about how this anger is really something that can be productive and can be useful. And Bell Hooks talks about this as well. So that's why I thought it would be, after you've read through all the history and such, to me, I was thinking as a finishing piece to really think about these feelings you're having, whether they be guilt or anger or sadness, which is I think these are common reactions to when we get into the depths of some of this work. And so thinking about, okay, well, what do I do with these feelings and these emotions, and how do I, what's the next step? So, yeah, I'd be curious to hear this week, as you've gone through this work, where you are with that in terms of if this is something that's been new to you and you've come across before and read it, or if this is completely, for some of you, the first time really ever getting into some of these pieces more specifically. And the last thing that I'd kind of like to talk about today is the Tim Wise piece, White Like Me. I find this piece really useful. I think there's a lot of interesting examples that he gives in here, like when he talks about affirmative action, as well as when we scholarships and informations like that. But I also want to first highlight something this has been recently brought to my attention that I felt conflicted to share with the class as well. A lot of times Beverly Tatum actually was the one who coined the word ally in terms of working with white anti-racist work, working with and to and for people of color. And so, but there's also a critique of this, and I think it's something that we always need to keep at the forefront of our consciousness as we go through this work. I say we because I'm speaking from my perspective of being a white anti-racist scholar. So ally work really requires your personal histories and complex identities, right? So again, that's what I keep coming back to and asking you to consider. But I recently came across an article that was talking about the challenges of being the white ally through a critique format, though. And this came to my attention. I'm thinking about unpacking the white privilege of Tim Wise. So I've seen Tim Wise speak before, and he's an anti-racist educator. And if you see in the beginning of the documentary, he tells you a little bit about himself and how he got into this work. And I've heard him acknowledge his privilege and understanding that the way that he's perceived doing this work is not the same as if a person of color was giving these lectures. And that is problematic. And this particular author, Asa Yande, talks about 3 privileges associated with people who are white anti-racist educators. So the first is that ability to paraphrase and or otherwise exploit the analysis of the Black liberation struggle and have it received by others as though it were their own. So that's the challenge that is had when you're reading through work, thinking of your position. And in this case, right, we're talking about race this week. So think about maybe whatever position you're in, other forms of oppression, when you're trying to understand and learn about other groups of struggle, how easily you can slip into acting as if you understand it. So that is a privilege that can easily be conflated in these situations. 2, the ability to emotionally express the views about racism without having the expression dismantled as angry or too emotional. And in this particular case, you might have think about the phrase that's sometimes coined, like the angry black man or the angry black woman. And as a white scholar, he can stand up and be angry and critique these things. And if you follow his feed on Facebook, he's crazy. He sounds angry and he drops the F-bomb and everything. And but yet he's not going to be called angry. I don't know if I've heard anyone call him angry. So again, right there is a conception of white privilege that we may not necessarily acknowledge right away. And then third, being honored for their anti-racist work as a black activist counterparts and other activists of color are denounced and derided. So this being honored for anti-racist work, it's a complicated one, I think, because of the fact that it's kind of essentializing their work for a group of people rather than with a group of people. So these are kind of some of the things, though, that I would like to point out. I don't show you this because I'm discrediting the documentary. I think it's very valuable, and I think we can learn a lot from it. But what I would like to highlight is that no matter what position we're in, there's always different arraignments of privilege in some way, and it just because you have one privilege, it doesn't discount the other, and such. So we always need to be constantly aware of where we're coming from and how we're expressed and how we're perceived, and this is where an example of critical reflection should come in. So Tim Wise, I'm sure, has been through this own reflection. I'm sure he's read these critiques of himself and it has addressed him. And so as he goes through his work, as all of us should, we are continually evolving and critiquing ourselves and working through these critiques. So with that being said, though, one of the things that he charges us to do in this documentary is really to think about the importance of recognizing race and privilege and working against that. And this ties into Senso and Giangelo's Chapter 8, where they go through the concepts of what white supremacy looks like and white privilege, and a bunch of different statistics that, or not statistics, sorry, a bunch of different misconceptions about racism. So definitely pay attention to that as you're reading through, and think about if you've ever found yourself in a position, whether it be race or in another form of looking at a marginalized identity, finding yourself perhaps justifying something in some way. So this is all part of our internal interrogation of ourselves as we go through this, and we continue to think about the different roles that race and whiteness and racism and privilege and power and all of this impact society, which in turn impact education. So that is a long spiel for this week, but I'm really excited for this week and for the readings that we have in light of some of the things that have been happening. And I'm going to pull up the discussion board post here. So the first question, I really had a hard time forming these questions this week because there was really so many concepts and ideas that I wanted to share. And so this is what I've come down to. So as you've gone through all the documentaries and readings, I'd like for you to think about the events we've seen in the news media. So like Rachel Dolezal, Tamir Rice, the Charleston terrorist attack. What are some of the ways race has been used to racialize inequality? So to make connections between what we know historically and how we still are seeing that play out today. So I'd really like to see you take this as the ultimate test of understanding the historical implications of the socially constructed idea of race and how that continues to permeate our society. How has race been used to shift attention and responsibility away from oppressors and toward targets of oppression? So this question, of course, is, like I said, is made to think about the broader society. I have on the bottom here highlighted some articles from the past 2 weeks that really are talking about this idea of structural societal racism. So there's an article here about the Charleston shooting, a really interesting new Tim Wise movie documentary is going to be coming out of looking at how white riots and black protests are perceived in the media. So media is really important here. An article here about the Cleveland police officer who shot the 12-year-old Tamir Rice. And then just an overview of kind of what's happening with Rachel Dolezal. And so there's some articles there to refer to should you not be aware of what's going on. So the second question is going to be tying back to Beverly Tatum's work and the American Invention of Intelligence, where she really documents how intelligence tests were formed and have continued to perpetuate inequalities in schools. So I'd really like you to look at that in connection with the documentary. And then lastly, I have 2 questions here. I couldn't decide, so I'm going to give you the choice. The first question, if Lord's work is really speaking to you, I'd like for you to focus on that question. She argues anger is an appropriate reaction to racist attitudes. So I'd like for you to respond to that assertion. I want you to make sure you're following her argument between anger and hatred as well. Or, if White Like Me spoke to you, refer back to that documentary. And I want you to think about what are the costs of racism for white people? So why should white people want to work to address white privilege? And more importantly, how can all people collectively work to address issues of race and privilege? So using information from the documentaries as well as perhaps some of your own experiences. So you can choose to answer either of these questions. Okay, oops. Go back to where we were. Okay, and then for class number 3 on Thursday, we're going to be moving into religion and education, but we're also going to be coming back to race through everything because we're building upon intersectionality here. So you're going to be reading James' piece, which is an excerpt from the book Religion in the Classroom. You're going to read the White piece, which talks about connecting religion and teacher identity, and you're going to read the Rubin piece, which talks about Jewish culture and how discussions of Judaism are left out of social justice discourse. So you're also going to be watching the documentary Real Bad Arabs, which is speaking about Arabs as a group of ethnicity, but also begins to talk about Islamophobia. So I'd like to kind of connect all of these ideas of privilege and power with these religious identities. Discussion 2's post for today's class is going to be due by Tuesday by 6 p.m. So remember, every Tuesday and every Thursday, you have a post due by 6 p.m. So that's on the discussion board. You have 24 hours to respond to your classmates. So Tuesdays and Thursdays, you should be posting and then responding within 24 hours. On Fridays is when you turn in your reflections, and those are once a week. That can go across. It can be classes 2 and 3's information. The Google Hangouts are only 1 time a week, so just to remind you again, they're only 1 time a week, moving forward, and they are from 3 to 4 unless otherwise indicated. This week's groups, which you're already going to be sorted out on the Canvas website, are up here as well, and I've highlighted who the leaders will be for the week. So again, these groups are randomly being assigned through Canvas so that you're able to have interaction with your different classmates. So good luck with the readings and catching up with this week. I will have the next lecture up by Sunday, hopefully, and I will also be doing grading through this weekend. So I look forward to reading everyone's posts and reflections, and I hope you have a great weekend.